So right now we've got very basic model tests, but let's say that we wanted to create a test for a route. So again, we would probably end up putting this in a separate file, but just for the moment, let's just say that what we want to do is we want to describe some routes, and in particular, let's say that we have a route for a GET request that's going to end up going to /API users, because that's one of our models. So we would expect that if we ended up calling that route, that we would end up getting back our 3 users. So what might that look like? Well, let's start off by putting in an it. And what we're going to do is we're going to put something in here that says, and I'm going to do a return here, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But I'm going to say app return app.get, which doesn't exist at the moment, /API users. And I'm going to say that when I make this request, I expect to get a 200. Let's just see where all this is coming from. None of this is going to work at the moment. This will fail because app doesn't exist. Well, what we're going to do here is we're going to use a module called supertest. And what we're going to do is we're going to require supertest. Supertest returns a method. And we could call the method that it ends up returning, and we could end up requiring an express application. Now again, this is going to give us a couple of different problems, namely that app doesn't exist either, and we don't have supertest installed. So this fails because we don't have supertest installed. Let's kill this. Again, this is a testing library. So let's install supertest, and we're going to save dev. And at the same time that we're doing this, let's actually go and set up our app file. It's not going to be anything all that complex. Here's our app.js. We'll end up bringing into our app.js Express, which we'll probably have to install as well. This will be a regular dependency. So we have Express, and we'll need this in a second. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say app equals Express. Let's just go back and see where we are. Let's run our code again. Again, here we're going to run into a different problem that we don't have Express. So let's just install that really quick. And so this is going to be a regular dependency. This automatically will end up getting saved. And we'll have Express. And the interesting part about this is that we're not going to have to listen on any port. And the reason for this is that supertest will basically spin up an application, and it'll allow us to make requests. What do I mean by an application? Well, an application is going to be an Express application that has a set of routes. Now, we get an interesting error here. And the error is basically, I don't really know what to do with this thing because I do have an app. This is a supertest error. And what it's really looking for is it's looking for us to actually export our app. This is a really common pattern. And we'll talk a little bit later about why we didn't name this server, why we ended up naming it app. And here, we actually get an error that makes some sense. I got a 200 where, you expected a 200, but you got a 404. So just for the moment, just to get this to pass, what we could end up doing is we could specify app.get API users and put in a handler for this route. And we'll just say response.send, and I'm just going to send an empty array. And now our test will end up passing. Well, we expect that when we end up making this call, let's go back to our spec, we want to see what the users look like. So the other thing that supertest ends up giving us, and one other important note here, is that this is asynchronous. And one of the things that Mocha does is that if a promise ends up getting returned from this callback function, it'll wait for that callback to end up completing. So it's important that you end up putting this return here because we don't want the test to run immediately. We want this to be a promise that ends up getting resolved. So what we can end up doing here is we can actually put a then here. And this gives us the response that we get from the server. And that response can be made up of a bunch of things, but what we're interested in is the response.body, which is going to be the data that we get back. And we could write an expectation. And here we're actually using the expect function from Chai, and we'll say that the response.body is going to have a length 2 equal 3. We've got 3 users in our system. And we get this error that says, no, you only sent back 0. And that's true, because one of the things that we have yet to do here is to bring in our const. And we'll say we're going to end up bringing in our models. And we're going to do this from require ./db. That's one of the things we end up exporting. And we'll end up destructuring, and we'll say user equals, and we'll destructure that from models. And now what we could do is we could use our async await. When we're in a route, you really have to put a try catch here, because or else the user is never going to end up seeing anything. If we have an error, we call next with the exception. We've got async here, and I'm simply going to say response.send, and we're going to await, and we'll say user find all. And that's going to send back the users that we have in our system, and our tests are going to end up passing. And just to sort of realize that we've got some control over this, if we decided to add another user here, which we could do, our tests will end up breaking in 2 spots, but easy enough. We could go back and fix them and go in here and say this really is going to be 4 users. And we could go over here and say there are 4 users because that's what we're syncing our data with. And the one thing that's interesting about this is we could actually run these tests, and we're testing out our routes without ever having to go and really spin up a server. We're letting supertest do the work. And again, the most important line here is that we're requiring supertest. Supertest returns a constructor function that has these methods. It allows us to call get on it. We could then call expect on what we end up getting back. So if we went over here and said, hey, look, we expected to get a 201 here, this would end up failing. And if we wanted to, we could get this to pass. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but we could set the status and get that to pass. Let's change this back to 200. And so we've got a fair amount of functionality. We could always go and separate our test files out. We could separate our data layer out into separate files. But one thing that we know now is we've got some tests that are not only documenting the system, how things are supposed to work, but also giving us, again, some level of security that, maybe that's not the right word for it, but some level of security that our changes are not breaking the application.